Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her palm against the cold stone wall, feeling the ancient carvings beneath her fingertips. The underground chamber stretched before her like a cathedral carved from living rock, its ceiling disappearing into shadows that her headlamp couldn't penetrate. She had been searching for this place for 7 years, following whispers and fragments of texts that most scholars dismissed as fantasy. Now, standing in the heart of what could only be the lost city of Corinthos, she realized that everything she thought she knew about ancient civilization was wrong. The expedition had begun 3 months earlier in the mountains of Central Asia, where satellite imagery had revealed unusual geometric patterns beneath the earth. Sarah's team had drilled through 40 feet of compacted soil and rock before breaking through into this vast network of chambers. What they found defied explanation. The architecture was too advanced, too perfectly preserved, too impossibly old. Carbon dating suggested the structures were at least 12,000 years old, predating the earliest known civilizations by thousands of years. Marcus Way, her lead archaeologist, called out from across the chamber. His voice echoed off walls covered in inscriptions unlike any known writing system. Sarah made her way toward him, her boots crunching on a floor made of polished black stone that reflected her light like a mirror. Marcus stood before a massive doorway, its surface covered in what appeared to be a map of the night sky. But the constellations were wrong, shifted in ways that suggested either a different time period or a different perspective on the heavens entirely. "Sarah, you need to see this," Marcus said, his voice tight with excitement. He pointed to a series of symbols running along the doorway's frame. "I've been comparing these marks to everything in our database. They don't match any known language, but the mathematical patterns are consistent. This is definitely a written language, and it's incredibly sophisticated. Look at the way the symbols interconnect. It's almost like computer code." Sarah leaned closer, tracing the symbols with her gloved hand. They seemed to shimmer in the light, though that had to be a trick of the mineral composition. As she studied them, a pattern began to emerge. The symbols weren't just decorative. They told a story, and the more she looked, the more she could almost grasp their meaning. It was like trying to remember a dream that slipped away the moment you reached for it. The rest of the team gathered around as Sarah photographed every inch of the doorway. Chun-Li, their linguist, muttered continuously into her recorder, documenting observations and theories. James Patterson, the expedition's funding representative, stood back with his arms crossed, clearly calculating the monetary value of what they had found. Sarah didn't care about the money. This discovery would rewrite human history. It would prove that advanced civilization existed long before anyone imagined possible. As night fell outside, the team decided to attempt opening the doorway. Sarah knew they should wait, should document everything more thoroughly, should bring in more experts. But something pulled at her, an urgency she couldn't explain. The inscriptions seemed to suggest a warning, though she couldn't say how she knew that. The symbols spoke of something that had been sealed away, something that needed to remain undisturbed. Yet here they were about to break that seal. Marcus worked on the door's mechanism for hours, identifying pressure points and counterweights hidden within the stone. The engineering was remarkable, using principles of leverage and balance that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. Finally, with a grinding sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, the door began to move. Stone scraped against stone as a gap appeared, releasing air that hadn't been breathed in millennia. The smell was strange, not musty or decayed, but fresh somehow, like mountain air after a storm. They pushed through into a chamber that took Sarah's breath away. The room was circular, easily 100 feet across, with walls that curved up into a dome. But it was what stood in the center that made her heart race. A massive crystal structure rose from the floor, reaching toward the ceiling like a frozen fountain. It pulsed with a faint inner light, casting shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't move. Around its base, 12 stone seats faced inward, each carved with the same mysterious symbols that covered the doorway. Sarah approached the crystal slowly, aware that everyone was watching her. She was the expedition leader, and this moment would define everything that came after. As she drew closer, the crystal's light intensified, responding to her presence. She could hear a sound now, barely perceptible, like voices speaking in a language that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her mind. The crystal was trying to communicate, she realized. It held information, memories, perhaps the entire history of this forgotten empire. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the crystal surface. The world exploded into light and sound. Images flooded her mind faster than thought. She saw the empire at its height, cities that stretched to the horizon, technology that made modern civilization look primitive. She saw the people of Corinthos, not so different from humans today, but possessing knowledge that had been lost to time. And then she saw what happened to them, why they vanished overnight, and the horror of it made her scream. The crystals showed her everything, and in that moment, Sarah Chin understood that some discoveries should have remained buried forever. Sarah collapsed to the stone floor, her mind reeling from the flood of images the crystal had unleashed. Marcus rushed to her side, shouting her name, but his voice sounded distant and distorted, as if she were underwater. The visions continued, overwhelming her consciousness with scenes of a world that had been erased from history. She could see through the eyes of the ancient Corinthos people, feel their emotions, understand their thoughts. They were showing her something, these ghosts of a civilization, and they were desperate for her to comprehend the message. The empire of Corinthos had been magnificent beyond imagining. In her vision, Sarah walked streets paved with stones that glowed softly in the darkness, illuminating the way for citizens who moved with purpose and grace. Buildings reached toward the sky in elegant spirals, their architecture defying gravity through principles of engineering that modern science had yet to discover. Gardens grew on every rooftop, fed by water systems that drew moisture from the air itself. The people wore clothing woven from materials that changed color with their moods, and they communicated through both spoken language and a form of telepathic connection that linked their minds in a vast network of shared consciousness. But it was their technology that truly astounded her. The Corinthos had mastered energy in ways that made nuclear power look like a child's toy. They drew power from the earth itself, tapping into currents that flowed through the planet like blood through veins. Their machines were works of art, combining crystal formations with metal alloys that shouldn't have been possible to create. They had conquered disease, extended their lifespans to centuries, and explored consciousness in ways that blurred the line between the physical and spiritual realms. The vision shifted, and Sarah found herself in a vast council chamber where 12 figures sat in seats identical to those surrounding the crystal. These were the guardians, the leaders of Corinthos, chosen not for their power but for their wisdom. They debated in voices that rang with urgency and fear. Something was coming, something they had accidentally awakened in their quest for knowledge. They called it the Void, though Sarah sensed that was merely the closest translation her mind could manage. It was an entity, or perhaps a force of nature, that existed in the spaces between reality, and their experiments had torn open a doorway that should have remained forever closed. She watched as the Guardians made their terrible decision. They could not fight the Void. It consumed everything it touched, unmaking matter and energy, leaving nothing behind. Already, the outer territories of the Empire had fallen silent, their citizens simply ceasing to exist. The Guardians had only one option remaining. They would use their most powerful technology, the very crystals that powered their civilization, to create a barrier. But the cost would be absolute. Every man, woman, and child in Corinthos would need to contribute their life energy to power the seal. They would sacrifice themselves completely, erasing their existence from the world, to trap the Void and prevent it from consuming all life on Earth. The vision showed Sarah the final hours of Corinthos. Citizens gathered in the Great Plaza, joining hands and opening their minds to the telepathic network one last time. There was no panic, no chaos. They faced their end with dignity and courage, understanding that their sacrifice would save countless billions who would come after them. Children stood beside their parents, elderly citizens stood beside the young, all united in their final act of defiance against the darkness. The Guardians activated the crystal network, and Sarah felt the surge of energy as millions of lives poured into the seal. The Empire didn't fall. It didn't crumble or burn. It simply ceased to be. In an instant, every person vanished, their bodies dissolving into pure energy that fed the barrier. The cities stood empty, the machines fell silent, the lights went dark. The void raged against the seal, hammering at it with force that shook the foundations of reality, but the barrier held. The sacrifice had worked. The void was trapped, contained within a prison made from the collective will of an entire civilization. And then, gradually, the world forgot. The empty cities were buried by time, covered by soil and vegetation, until no trace remained of the empire that had given everything to save a world that would never know they existed. Sarah's consciousness returned to her own body with a jolt that left her gasping. She was lying on the chamber floor, her team gathered around her with expressions of concern and confusion. Hours had passed, though to her it had felt like only moments. Marcus helped her sit up, and she noticed that her hands were shaking. The crystal behind them had dimmed, its light now barely perceptible, as if the effort of sharing its knowledge had drained it. "What happened?" Chun-Li asked, her voice tight with worry. "You touched the crystal, and then you just collapsed. We couldn't wake you. Your eyes were open, but you weren't seeing us. It was like you were somewhere else entirely." Sarah struggled to find words that could convey what she had experienced. How could she explain that she had lived through the final days of an empire, felt the thoughts and emotions of people who had been dead for 12,000 years? The visions had been so vivid, so real, that her own life now felt like the dream. She looked around at her team, seeing them with new eyes. They had no idea what they had stumbled upon. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was a warning and a burden. "They're still here," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "The people of Corinthos. Their consciousness, their memories, everything they were, it's all stored in the crystal network. They uploaded themselves into it when they created the seal. They've been waiting all this time for someone to find them, to hear their warning." James Patterson stepped forward, his face eager. "Warning? What kind of warning?" Sarah pulled herself to her feet, leaning on Marcus for support. She looked at the crystal, then at the 12 empty seats surrounding it. The void. The thing they sealed away 12,000 years ago. It's still here, still trapped beneath this city. And the seal is weakening. That's why the crystal activated when I touched it. It's been waiting for someone who could understand, someone who could continue what the Guardian started. She met each team member's eyes in turn, seeing her own fear reflected back at her. "We didn't just discover a lost civilization. We discovered a tomb, and the thing buried inside is starting to wake up." The temperature in the chamber dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs as frost began to form on the walls, spreading outward from the crystal in delicate patterns that resembled writing. The team backed away instinctively, but Sarah stood her ground, understanding now what was happening. The void was responding to their presence, aware for the first time in millennia that someone had entered its prison. It was testing the seal, probing for weaknesses, and the crystal was struggling to contain it. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, trying to pull her toward the exit. "We need to leave, now. Whatever's happening here, we're not equipped to deal with it." "No," Sarah said firmly, shaking him off. "If we leave, if we abandon this place without understanding what we're dealing with, the void will break free. The Guardians showed me everything. The seal requires conscious maintenance. It needs someone to feed it energy, to reinforce it with willpower and intention. That's why the Guardians created this chamber, why they left their knowledge in the crystal. They knew that eventually, the seal would weaken, and someone would need to take their place." Chun-Li had her tablet out, frantically documenting the frost patterns. Her scientific mind refused to accept the impossible, even as it unfolded before her eyes. "This doesn't make sense. You're talking about consciousness as if it's a tangible thing, as if thoughts and willpower can affect physical reality. That's not how the universe works." "That's not how our understanding of the universe works," Sarah corrected. But the Corinthos knew something we don't. They understood that consciousness isn't just a byproduct of brain chemistry. It's a fundamental force, like gravity or electromagnetism. They learned to harness it, to shape reality through focused intention. That's how they built this empire, and that's how they created the seal. A sound echoed through the chamber, low and resonant, like a horn blown in a distant cave. The crystal flared brighter, and the frost on the walls melted instantly, evaporating into steam that filled the air with white mist. Through the fog, Sarah saw shapes moving, translucent figures that flickered in and out of existence. The Guardians were manifesting, their preserved consciousness reaching out from the crystal to communicate more directly. The figures coalesced into 12 distinct forms, each one seated in their respective chairs around the crystal. They looked human but perfected somehow, their features symmetrical and their expressions calm despite the urgency of the situation. When they spoke, their voices bypassed physical sound, resonating directly in Sarah's mind with such clarity that it was like hearing her own thoughts. "You understand," the Central Guardian said, though his lips didn't move. "You received our memories, experienced our history. Now you must make the same choice we made so long ago. The seal weakens with each passing day. In 10 cycles of your moon, it will fail completely. The void will be free, and it will consume everything in its path. Your cities, your people, your entire world will cease to exist." James Patterson had gone pale, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by barely controlled terror. "This is insane. These are hallucinations, probably caused by gas leaking from the crystal or some kind of psychoactive mineral in the air. We need to evacuate and seal this chamber permanently." "Sealing the chamber won't stop what's coming," another Guardian interjected, her form flickering like a candle flame in wind. "The void exists outside your concept of space. It is contained by will alone, by the conscious intention of those who understand its nature. When the seal fails, it will emerge not from this chamber, but from the fabric of reality itself, tearing through your world like paper." Sarah felt the weight of destiny pressing down on her shoulders. She had spent her entire career searching for ancient mysteries, driven by curiosity and the desire to understand humanity's origins. Now she had found something beyond her wildest dreams, and it came with a burden that threatened to crush her. The Guardians weren't asking for her help. They were telling her that she had no choice. She had touched the crystal, received their knowledge, and in doing so, bound herself to their ancient purpose. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite her fear. The Central Guardian rose from his seat, his form becoming more solid as he approached her. "You must become the 13th Guardian, the bridge between our time and yours. The seal requires life energy to maintain its integrity. The Coranthos gave everything, but their sacrifice is nearly spent. You must gather others, people strong in will and purpose, and together you must feed the seal. Not with your lives, as we did, but with conscious effort. Daily meditation, focused intention, the combined willpower of a dedicated group. It will not be easy. It will consume your time, your energy, your very sense of self. But it is the only way." Marcus had been listening in silence, his expression shifting from fear to determination. "How many people? How long do we have to prepare?" 12 is the sacred number," a different Guardian answered. 12 minds working in perfect harmony, their consciousness linked through the crystal network. You have 10 moon cycles to find them, to teach them what you know, and to establish the meditation pattern that will hold the seal. After that, the vigil must never cease. One Guardian must always be active, maintaining the barrier, or the void will sense the weakness and strike. Sarah looked at her team, seeing the disbelief and fear warring in their faces. She couldn't blame them. What the Guardians were proposing sounded like fantasy, like something from a myth or a legend rather than reality. But she had felt the truth of it when she touched the crystal. She had experienced the void's hunger, its absolute emptiness that negated existence itself. It was real and it was waiting. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll find the others. I'll learn whatever I need to learn. But you have to give me more than visions and warnings. I need practical knowledge. How do we link our consciousness? How do we channel our energy into the seal? And how do I convince anyone to give up their normal life to sit in meditation for hours every day, guarding against a threat they can't see or prove exists?" The Central Guardian smiled, and for a moment Sarah saw the man he had been thousands of years ago, before he made his terrible sacrifice. "We will teach you everything." The crystal holds not just memories, but techniques, practices refined over centuries. You will learn to see beyond the physical, to perceive the currents of energy that flow through all things. And as for convincing others, you need not worry. The crystal calls to those who are meant to serve. They will come, drawn by dreams and intuitions they cannot explain. Your task is simply to be ready when they arrive. The Guardian reached out and placed his translucent hand on Sarah's forehead. Knowledge flooded into her mind, but this time it was organized and controlled. She saw meditation techniques, breathing exercises, methods for focusing consciousness and linking minds across distance. She learned to perceive the seal itself, a vast web of energy that surrounded the void's prison like a cocoon. And she saw the cracks forming in that cocoon, small fissures that grew wider with each passing hour. When the Guardian removed his hand, Sarah swayed, but remained standing. She turned to her team, seeing them with new clarity. Marcus, whose loyalty and courage would make him invaluable. Chun-Li, whose analytical mind could help them understand the science behind what seemed like magic. Even James, whose practicality and connections could provide the resources they would need. They were already the beginning of her circle. "I know this sounds crazy," she said, addressing them all. "I know you're scared and confused. But I'm asking you to trust me. Trust what I've seen, and what I know to be true. We have a chance to save the world, but only if we act now. Will you help me?" The chamber fell silent as her team exchanged glances, each weighing the choice before them. Outside this underground sanctuary, life continued normally, billions of people going about their daily existence with no idea of the darkness that threatened them all. The fate of humanity rested on the decision of a handful of scientists standing in an ancient tomb, and the clock was already ticking. 6 weeks after their initial discovery, Sarah stood in a converted warehouse in Geneva, watching as the 11th Guardian to be arrived. They had come from around the world, each one responding to what they described as a calling, a dream that had led them to search for information about Corinthos. Some were scientists like herself, others were spiritual practitioners, and a few were ordinary people with extraordinary sensitivity to the unseen currents of energy that the Guardians had taught her to perceive. Finding them had been easier than she expected. The crystal had been right. Those meant to serve felt its pull across thousands of miles. Marcus had helped her set up this facility, using his contacts and most of their expedition funding to create space where they could work undisturbed. They had transported key artifacts from the underground chamber, including a smaller crystal that served as a link to the main seal. The Swiss government had been surprisingly cooperative once James leveraged his connections in the scientific community, though they had no idea what was really at stake. The official story was that they were studying an archaeological find that required controlled conditions. The truth would have gotten them locked up in a psychiatric ward. The newcomer was a woman named Yuki Tanaka from Japan, a former Buddhist monk who had left her monastery after experiencing visions of the void. She moved with the grace of someone accustomed to meditation, her eyes taking in the warehouse's interior with calm acceptance. When she saw Sarah, recognition flashed across her face. They had never met, but the crystal had shown each potential guardian the faces of the others, preparing them for this moment. "I've been dreaming of this place for 3 weeks," Yuki said, her English accented but clear. "In my dreams, I saw 12 people sitting in a circle, holding back an ocean of darkness. I didn't understand what it meant until I read about your discovery online. The images you published, the symbols from the underground chamber, they matched the ones I had been drawing in my sleep." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Each guardian candidate had experienced something similar, their subconscious minds touched by the crystal's reach. "We're almost complete. You're number 11. We're still waiting for the 12th, and then we can begin the real work." She led Yuki through the warehouse to the central chamber they had constructed, a circular room with 12 seats arranged around the smaller crystal. The other candidates were already there, practicing the meditation techniques Sarah had taught them. Some sat with eyes closed, their breathing deep and regular. Others gazed at the crystal, learning to perceive the energy flowing through it. They were making progress, but Sarah could feel time running out. The seal weakened daily, and she had nightmares of waking to find the world ending around her. Chunli approached with her latest readings, her tablet displaying graphs and measurements that would have looked like nonsense to anyone outside their group. The energy fluctuations are increasing. Yesterday, we detected 3 major spikes, each one corresponding to what felt like pressure against the seal. It's probing more actively now, searching for the weak points. How long do we have? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. At the current rate of deterioration, maybe 3 weeks before catastrophic failure. But that's assuming the decay rate stays constant. If the void realizes how close it is to breaking through, it might push harder. We could have days instead of weeks. Sarah felt her stomach knot with anxiety. They needed the 12th guardian, and they needed to establish the meditation pattern immediately. But rushing the process could be worse than not doing it at all. The guardians had been clear that the circle must function in perfect harmony. One weak link, one moment of doubt or distraction, and the seal could shatter under the strain. Mikhail Petrov, a former Russian physicist who had become one of their most dedicated students, stood up from his meditation. I felt something just now. A presence, another consciousness trying to reach the crystal. They're close, maybe in the city already. Sarah concentrated, extending her awareness through the crystal's link as the ancient guardians had taught her. Yes, there it was, a bright spark of consciousness moving through Geneva's streets, drawn inexorably toward the warehouse. The 12th guardian was coming. She could feel their confusion and excitement, the sense of destiny pulling them forward despite their rational minds' protests. Whoever they were, they would arrive soon. While they waited, Sarah gathered the group to review what they had learned. The meditation pattern was complex, requiring each guardian to maintain specific mental states while remaining connected to the others through the crystal network. They would work in shifts, with 3 guardians active at all times, their combined consciousness channeling energy into the seal. Every 8 hours, a new trio would take over, creating a continuous flow of protection that never ceased. It sounded simple, but the reality was exhausting. Even experienced meditators found it difficult to maintain the necessary focus for more than a few hours. The ancient guardians had made it look effortless in Sarah's visions, but they had trained for decades, perhaps centuries, perfecting their techniques. Sarah's group had barely 6 weeks of practice, and some of them were complete novices when they arrived. It should have been impossible, but somehow they were managing. The crystal helped, guiding their consciousness and amplifying their efforts. Still, Sarah knew that maintaining this vigil indefinitely would push them all to their limits. The warehouse door opened, and a young man entered, his eyes wide with wonder and fear. He looked barely out of college, with dark curly hair and the rumpled clothing of someone who had traveled a long distance in a hurry. Sarah recognized him instantly from the crystal's visions. Ethan Drake, an American graduate student studying consciousness and quantum physics at MIT. He had been experiencing spontaneous out-of-body experiences for months, his consciousness reaching out and accidentally brushing against the seal. I know this is going to sound insane, Ethan said, his words tumbling out in a rush, but I've been having these episodes where I feel like I'm falling into nothingness. And then I found your research paper on the Caranthos discovery, and I knew I had to come here. Something's been calling to me, pulling me halfway around the world, and I don't understand what's happening, but I know it's important. Sarah smiled despite her anxiety. Welcome, Ethan. You're exactly where you need to be. We have a lot to explain and not much time to do it. Over the next 48 hours, Sarah pushed the group harder than she had dared before. Ethan proved to be a natural, his young mind adapting quickly to the meditation techniques. The crystal seemed to recognize him, its light brightening whenever he came near. Sarah wondered if he had been touched by the void during his out-of-body experiences, marked in some way that made him particularly sensitive to its presence. Whatever the reason, his addition to the group strengthened their collective power noticeably. On the morning of the 49th day after their initial discovery, Sarah woke to find the warehouse filled with an oppressive pressure that made it hard to breathe. The seal was failing faster than Chunli had predicted. She could feel the void pressing against the barrier, no longer probing cautiously, but hammering at it with desperate fury. It knew that new guardians were preparing to reinforce the seal, and it was making one final push to break free before they could establish their pattern. She ran to the central chamber, finding the other guardians already gathered around the crystal. They felt it too, the urgency that screamed through their linked consciousness. There was no more time for practice or preparation. They had to act now, or everything the ancient Coranthos had sacrificed for would be lost. Sarah took her seat in the circle, the other 11 guardians doing the same. They joined hands, opened their minds, and reached out through the crystal toward the seal. The sensation was overwhelming. Sarah felt herself expanding, her consciousness spreading across vast distances until she could perceive the seal in its entirety. It was beautiful and terrible, a web of light stretched across a darkness that hurt to look at. She could feel the other guardians beside her, their minds merging with hers in a way that transcended individuality. They were 12 and they were one, united in purpose and determination. Together, they reached out and poured their combined will into the seal, reinforcing the barrier that stood between humanity and oblivion. The void fought back. Sarah felt its hunger, its desperate need to consume and unmake.
It was not evil, she realized.
It was simply its nature, like fire that burns or water that drowns. But understanding didn't make it less dangerous. She pushed harder, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Around the circle, the other guardians did the same, their faces tight with concentration as they struggled to hold back the darkness. And slowly, incredibly, the seal began to stabilize. The cracks stopped growing, the pressure eased, and the desperate hammering of the void against the barrier faded to a dull, constant push. They were doing it. 12 ordinary people, barely trained and terrified out of their minds, were succeeding where billions would have failed. They were becoming the new guardians, the watchers who would stand between the world and its destruction.